Helen was born in a small town in rural Kansas, where time seemed to move slowly and neighbors still greeted each other with a genuine smile. Her childhood was a simple life marked by long, barefoot summers and harsh winters where her grandmother's fireplace was the center of her world. From a young age, she demonstrated a rare care for others, helping classmates who forgot their snacks, sharing her only coat at recess, and often skipping playtime to care for her younger sister. At the time, no one imagined how much that generous heart would one day change so many lives. But God already knew. At 17, Helen lost her mother suddenly, and that's when she had to grow up incredibly fast. She abandoned her dream of studying nursing and stayed home to care for her father and younger siblings, working as a cashier at the corner store. She was always the last to eat, the first to get up, and never complained. On the contrary, she smiled even with her hands calloused from scrubbing the floor. She said that love is the only thing that, the more you give, the more you get. And she took that seriously, much more than anyone imagined. Before I continue, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, for we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, for His love is eternal and infinite. I also want to take this opportunity to ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me a lot, thank you. Now, hold on tight because Helen's story will surprise you more than you can imagine. What she experienced after that, you won't believe. Over time, Helen became the person everyone turned to when something went wrong. The lady who brought hot soup to sick neighbors, who drove to the next town just to take an elderly woman to the doctor, and who, even when her finances were tight, always found a way to help. She said her reward was not in this world, but in heaven, and maybe she was right. But not even the angels foresaw what was about to happen. One cold autumn of 1987, Helen found an abandoned baby on the church doorstep. Without a second thought, she took the child home and cared for him until social services found a solution. But what no one knew was that the child would leave a note hidden in the closet years later, a note that would only be discovered much later, when she least expected it. She never had much, but what she had she shared. In her simple home, with hand-sewn curtains and the smell of fresh bread, there was always room for one more dish on the table. Neighbors joked that her heart was bigger than Texas itself. And perhaps it was. Because even those who hurt her were eventually forgiven. Helen believed that holding a grudge was like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. In her youth, she turned down 2 marriage proposals. She said no man she'd met up until then was willing to love the way she believed love should be, with sacrifice, commitment, and purpose. She wanted more than flowers and dinners. She wanted a soul mate who shared her faith and her mission to care for others. That companion only appeared years later, in a place and time no one expected. Helen met Walter when she was already in her 40s. He was a quiet widower with a shy smile and hands that knew how to build anything, except a new life alone. They fell in love slowly, like someone heating water over a low heat. And when they married, it was a simple celebration in the backyard, with carrot cake and music played by the neighbors. But their union would bear fruit that would change the lives of many. They had no biological children, but they raised 5 children from the community as if they were their own flesh and blood. Helen sewed clothes, taught homework, and prepared snacks as if it were her divine mission, and perhaps it was. Years later, one of these children would become a doctor, another a pastor, a third a writer, and 2 would follow in Helen's footsteps, dedicating their lives to others. But not all of them would stick around. Amidst the joys, there was also deep pain. Helen lost her father on a rainy night, after a silent battle with cancer. That same week, one of her adopted children ran away from home, taking money from a drawer. She cried alone in her room, kneeling at the foot of her bed, asking God if she was truly on the right path. The answer would come years later, in a form no one could have imagined. During the 1990s, Helen became known as the neighborhood mother. Her phone rang in the wee hours with calls for help, and she never said no. Once, she drove for 3 hours with a woman in labor in the back seat of her car, and held her hand until the child was born. Years later, that child would return. But that's a topic for later. Her house was small, but the yard was full of sunflowers, her favorite flowers. They always seek the sun, even on cloudy days, she said. This was how she lived, seeking the good, even when everything seemed dark. And this, in a way, began to inspire other women in the neighborhood, who began to form a small prayer group on her porch every Wednesday afternoon. One of those neighbors was Martha, a woman who lived alone after losing her husband in the Vietnam War. Martha said Helen had saved her life, literally. One day, when Martha was about to give up, Helen appeared with an apple pie and a tight hug. That gesture changed the course of history. But no one ever spoke of it out loud. It was between them and God. Over time, Helen's faith grew even stronger. She read the Bible every morning, sitting in the rocking chair inherited from her grandmother. Her favorite passages were those that spoke of compassion, serving others, and reaping what one sows. And even when she didn't see immediate fruit, she kept planting. Because she believed, with all her heart, that God was watching everything. The seasons passed, wrinkles appeared, and Helen remained steadfast, even with her knees already tired and her vision a little blurry. She said the body ages, but the spirit, oh, the spirit can remain young when nourished by love. And her love was there. It never was. But no one imagined that, behind that calm smile, there was a deep weariness, a hidden desire that she herself had already forgotten. Even with all this dedication, Helen never received any recognition. No surprise parties, no tributes. People said, she does it because she loves it. But they didn't know how many times she cried in the shower, asking God for just one sign that her life had been worth living. And that sign, oh, it would come. So unexpectedly that it would change everything. The first clue came one ordinary morning, while Helen was sweeping the sidewalk. A young delivery man stopped, looked at her and said, "You're famous here, you know?" She laughed, not understanding. But the comment echoed in her mind. Something was beginning to change. She just didn't know what. Yeah. Helen always said that God never abandons us, even when the whole world turns its back. And she experienced this firsthand. Little by little, her childhood friends moved away, her neighbors moved to another town, her children grew up and moved on with their lives. She smiled as she said goodbye, but when she closed the door, loneliness screamed in the silence of the house. It was as if every room echoed memories that no longer had a voice. She tried to fill her time. She tended the garden with almost sacred dedication, baked cakes for Sunday services, and visited the local nursing home whenever she could. Many of the elderly there hadn't had visitors in years, but when they saw Helen, their eyes lit up. She brought stories, laughter, affection, and no one knew that, deep down, she was the one who needed it most. Wednesdays continued to be days of prayer on the porch. But over time, the women in the group began to leave. One went to live with her children, another fell ill, and a third simply disappeared from the routine. Helen, however, never missed a meeting. Not with a fever, not with pain. "If God is waiting for me here, how could I not come?" she would say. One of the most difficult moments was when Walter fell ill. The companion she'd waited so long for could now barely get out of bed. Helen spent sleepless nights applying compresses, holding his hand, and whispering psalms in the dark. And even when the doctors said there was nothing more to be done, she believed that love could still heal. But time had other plans. Walter left on a cloudy morning, his hands clasped in hers and a final peaceful breath. Helen didn't cry at the wake. She stood her ground, smiling at those who came to offer their condolences. But when she got home, she went into the bedroom and knelt beside the empty bed. "Lord, now it's just you and me," she said softly, and there she stayed for hours, until sunset. Without Walter, the house felt bigger and colder. Meals, once shared, were now limited to a single dish. She still placed 2 napkins on the table, out of habit. And sometimes she talked to herself, as if he were still there, listening to every word. Maybe he was. With her children far away, Helen sent letters, left messages on the phone, and sent gifts on special occasions. The replies were spaced out, short, and mechanical. "Sorry, Mom, life is busy." She understood. After all, she herself had dedicated her life to others. But deep down, there was a void that not even faith could completely fill. One Sunday during worship, the pastor spoke about the value of silence. Sometimes God puts us in the desert not to punish us, but to prepare us for something greater. Helen wept softly that day. She felt those words spoken straight to her heart. And somehow, it rekindled a flame within her. She started keeping a journal. Every day before bed, she would write down something she was grateful for. A beautiful sunset. An unexpected phone call. A cake that rose in the oven. Simple things, but they gradually filled the empty spaces in her soul. And without realizing it, she began to heal. It was during this time that Helen met a teenage girl named Emily, who lived 2 houses away. Emily lived with her grandparents and was shy, almost invisible. One day, Helen saw her crying at the gate and approached with tea and a blanket. From that moment on, something blossomed between them. Emily began visiting her every day after school. She helped with the housework, learned to sew, and listened to old stories. Helen felt that, for the first time in years, her presence was making a difference in someone's life. It was as if God had sent that girl to give back a little of what time had taken away. But what Helen didn't know was that Emily was also keeping a secret. A much bigger reason behind her constant visits. Something that would only come to light months later, when an old shoebox was opened in the attic. But that, for later. On one of the coldest days of that winter, the house's heater broke. Helen, already tired, considered spending the night with 3 blankets. But when she returned from church, she found a small heater on the door, with a note, "To the one who always warms everyone's heart. Emily." She wept silently that night. Helen asked for nothing. But little by little, she began to receive it. Small gestures, small kindnesses, a pie left on the doorstep, a note in the mail, flowers picked from the garden. It seemed that, even without knowing it, the people around her were beginning to notice the light she had always carried. Still, the days were long. And there were times when she wondered if it all made sense. Sometimes she would sit in her rocking chair and stare into space, feeling the wind in her white hair. "I'm ready, Lord," she would whisper. But the answer still didn't come. Then, on a seemingly ordinary morning, Helen received an unexpected call. A local TV producer wanted to interview her for a special on unsung heroes of the city. She almost hung up, thinking it was a prank. But it wasn't. And this phone call would be the beginning of something much bigger. On the day of the recording, Helen hesitated. She wore the same floral dress as always and didn't like cameras. But Emily encouraged her. "The world needs to hear your story, Helen." And so, with trembling hands and a racing heart, she sat in the living room chair and told her story to the camera. The video aired on a Friday night. And, to everyone's surprise, it went viral. Thousands of views, emotional comments, messages of gratitude from people who didn't even know her. Helen was shocked. But why? "I just did what anyone would do." Letters began to arrive. From all over the country. People said they were touched by her faith, her generosity, her strength. Some sent gifts. Others, prayer requests. Helen spent hours reading every word, tears streaming down her face. It was as if, finally, everything was making sense. Emily suggested creating a social media account. Helen laughed. "I barely know how to use a cell phone, girl." But she accepted. And there, in that digital space, she began sharing messages of hope, short prayers, simple recipes, and passages from the Bible. Soon, she became something of an internet grandmother. But not everything was rosy. Along with fame came criticism. People said it was all an act, that no one was that good. Helen felt the blow, but took a deep breath. "If even Jesus was rejected, who am I to expect applause from everyone?" she said, her eyes fixed on the crucifix in the room. She kept going. Because now, more than ever, she felt her mission wasn't over. There were more people to hug, more stories to hear, more lives to touch. And maybe, just maybe, there was still something God had in store. Something she could never have imagined. And it was when she least expected it that the doorbell rang. A common sound, on any given morning. But whoever was on the other side of the door would change everything she thought about life, the past, and love. It was Christmas Eve, and Helen had spent all day preparing dinner. Roasted turkey, caramelized sweet potatoes, pumpkin pie, and that special punch only she could make. The house smelled of cinnamon, hope, and longing. She set the table with great care, even though she knew no one would come. It was just her and God, once again. Early in the evening, she heard a noise at the gate. Peeking through the curtain, she saw a woman and 3 children standing outside, shivering from the cold. Helen didn't hesitate. She opened the door, offered them shelter, and asked if they were okay. The woman cried. "We were evicted yesterday. We have nowhere to go." Without hesitation, Helen invited everyone in. The woman, named Denise, said she had lost her job weeks before, and with bills piling up, they were forced to leave their apartment. They were sleeping in their car and had nothing to eat that night. Helen felt a tightness in her chest, but also a certainty. This dinner wasn't for her. She heated the punch, divided each plate, and sat the children at the table, their eyes shining. It was the first hot meal they'd had in days. Denise cried non-stop. "I asked God for a miracle, and He sent you." Helen just smiled, her eyes welling up. But deep down, she felt like this was the most special Christmas of her life. That night, they all slept together in the living room, wrapped in blankets. The children laughed, Denise softly sang Christmas carols, and Helen simply gave thanks. "Thank you, Lord, for giving me the privilege of serving." Little did she know that one of the children, named Noah, had memorized that night in every detail. Years later, he would tell this story on national television, and change the course of Helen's life forever. But that's a surprise yet to come. The next morning, Helen packed a basket filled with food, clothes, and her children's old toys and delivered it to the family. Denise promised she would return one day, with a better life, to give thanks. Helen simply held her hand and said, "When God sends someone to our door, we don't ask why. We just open it." In the years that followed, Helen never learned the whereabouts of Denise and the children. But whenever she saw a smiling child on the street, she felt a twinge of hope. "Maybe it's them, isn't it, Lord?" she murmured as she watered her sunflowers. Christmas took on a new meaning. Helen no longer bought gifts or decorated lavishly. She preferred to prepare small baskets to leave on the doorsteps of quiet homes, where she knew loneliness arose. She did this alone, in silence. Because for her, serving was her way of celebrating the birth of Jesus. And so, the story of that meal spread through the neighborhood. First in whispers, then in conversations at church. Some people began repeating the gesture, opening their homes to those who had nowhere to stay. Unwittingly, Helen had started a tradition, a chain of kindness. But even so, she never told the full story. She kept it in her heart like a treasure. She only spoke to God in her nightly prayers, when she lay in bed and gave thanks for that Christmas when love knocked on her door disguised as need. Years later, during an interview with a local television station, Helen was asked, "What was the most memorable moment of your life?" She took a deep breath, looked out the window, and replied, "It was when I shared my supper with Jesus and he had the face of a tired mother and 3 hungry children." The reporter didn't understand right away. But Emily, sitting next to her, held her hand tightly. Because she knew. She knew that Christmas, Helen had lived the true spirit of the gospel. And that story, though silent, was about to make a big splash in the world. Because life is like that. Sometimes the greatest miracle happens when you open the door without asking who's on the other side. And that door, Helen never closed again. For many years, Helen lived for her children. She woke early, made coffee, packed lunches, and sewed their clothes with her own hands. When they were sick, she watched over each fever like a treasure. When they smiled, it was as if the sky opened a crack just for her. She didn't mind not buying things for herself, as long as they lacked for nothing. And even after they grew up, she continued to send packages in the mail with socks, cakes, and loving notes. Always with a Bible verse and a prayer hidden between the folds of the fabric. But time passed, and the children grew apart. One moved to California, another married and took care of his new family. The youngest began working too much. The calls became quick and mechanical. Visits became rare. And the holidays became cold messages on the cell phone. Helen smiled nonetheless. She baked everyone's favorite cake for their birthdays, even if no one came to pick it up. She sent cards at Christmas and Easter. And she kept the responses in a box, short, curt replies that seemed formal. But she treasured them as if they were love letters. The hardest part was Mother's Day. For 2 years in a row, none of the 3 children called. Emily showed up with flowers and a tight hug, and Helen smiled gratefully. But when the girl left, she locked herself in her room and cried, hugging the Bible, repeating, "Even if a mother forgets her child, I, the Lord, will never forget you." She never complained. When asked about her children, she would say proudly, "They're doing well, working, growing." God is watching over them. But inside, the silence hurt. And sometimes, in the solitude of the night, she wondered if she had failed as a mother. One day, he received an unexpected call. It was his youngest son. He said he was having a hard time and needed help. Helen, without hesitation, sent everything she could. She sold some household items, sewed extra orders, and sent him the amount he requested. Never once did she charge anything. But he didn't call back. Not even to thank her. And Helen just prayed. Lord, if he's in trouble, may you deliver him. And if it's pride that's keeping him from coming back, may you catch up with him in your own time. And so, she continued to wait. Like the father of the prodigal son. With the porch light always on. The neighbors noticed the emptiness. They asked why the children weren't showing up. Helen just smiled. They're busy. Life is busy. But Emily saw beyond the smile. She saw the teary eyes, the long sighs, the loneliness disguised in everyday tasks. One Christmas, Emily wrote letters to each of Helen's children, asking them to visit their mother. She enclosed photos of the house, excerpts of notes Helen had kept, and a message, "She never gave up on you. Please don't give up on her." But only one responded. And even then, with no date set for his return. Helen found the letter and understood Emily's gesture. She hugged her and said, "You shouldn't have done that, but thank you." Emily cried, feeling the pain that wasn't hers, but that she now carried too. Because, in some way, Helen was her mother too. As the years passed, Helen began to speak less about her children. Not out of resentment, but out of protection. She wanted to preserve what remained of their memory as something beautiful. She preferred not to know the details of their separation. And she asked God for only one thing, that her children would be happy, even from afar. But heaven has its ways. And one day, one of Helen's daughters-in-law found an old notebook at home, filled with her mother-in-law's notes, prayers for her children, lists of blessings, dreams she had for each of them. She was moved and showed it to her husband. And something inside him began to change. This son, who hadn't spoken to his mother in years, called one Sunday morning. Helen answered, surprised. He simply said, "Mom, I read your prayers, and I felt your presence here in the house." She didn't respond. She just cried. And he, on the other end, cried too. It was the first step. In the following months, he called again frequently. He sent photos of his grandchildren. You asked about childhood recipes. And one day, he showed up unexpectedly at the door. Helen couldn't stop hugging him. Time had taken a long time, but now he was starting to give back. Their reunion was silent but intense. They strolled through the yard, picked flowers, and prayed together. He asked for forgiveness. She wouldn't let him break up. "You were always mine. You never had to ask me for that." And there, they sealed a new beginning. The other children would take longer to return. But this gesture rekindled hope. Helen returned to setting 3 plates on the table on Sundays. And every morning, she prayed for each of them by name. Because her faith never grew old. And a mother's love knows no distance. Emily, seeing all this, decided to record some videos of Helen telling stories of motherhood, overcoming, and forgiveness. She posted them on social media, and the videos went viral. People across the country were moved. Some wrote, "This made me call my mom after 10 years." Unintentionally, Helen became a symbol of forgotten but not defeated mothers. Women who gave up everything and waited in silence. And now, they were beginning to be heard. She received letters, flowers, prayer requests. And she responded to them all with the same affection as always. And then, at a church event, one of the children made a surprise appearance. During the service, the pastor called him to the pulpit. He cried and said, "It took me so long to understand, but my mother is a hero." And Helen, sitting in the front pew, simply raised her hands to the heavens in gratitude. The last daughter resisted the most. But one day, hearing an old song from her childhood, she called her mother and said, "I dreamed about you yesterday. We were singing together in the car. I think God is calling me back." Helen simply replied, "I never let you go, daughter." And so, time sewed together the loose threads. Slowly, patiently. Because, as the word says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Helen lived through each of these phases. And now, she was beginning to see the fruits. But even with her children around, she knew her mission wasn't over yet. Because there were more broken hearts out there. And she was ready to continue being a mother to whoever needed her. The street where Helen lived was one of those streets that seemed frozen in time. Simple houses, low fences, ancient trees, and neighbors who knew each other by name. And even as the years passed and new people arrived, she remained the soul of the place. The woman who knew when someone was sick, who brought cake when a baby was born, who silently offered her shoulder to cry on at wakes. Helen's porch was almost a gathering place. On Saturday afternoons, she would make lemonade and sit in the rocking chair. Soon someone would appear, Martha with her memories of her youth, Ben with the week's newspapers, or little Lucy wanting to learn to crochet. It was there that stories were told, laughter echoed, and hearts healed. When one of her neighbors lost her job, Helen organized a silent fundraiser and left the envelope in the family's mailbox. When a young woman was cheated on by her fiancé, Helen took her in as a daughter. And when an elderly man fell and broke his leg, Helen cooked and cleaned his house for weeks. All without fanfare. Without asking for anything in return. She said Jesus didn't ask if someone deserved it before helping. He simply loved. And that's what she tried to do, love with actions. With pots, pans, prayers, visits. Each gesture was a brick in an invisible temple she had been building on that street for decades. Over time, people began to call her Street Grandma. Even those who lived far away came to visit her, just to chat, ask for advice, or receive a hug. Helen had that gift of listening without interrupting, of smiling without judgment, of praying with those who no longer knew how to pray. When someone moved in, they made a point of preparing a welcome basket. Homemade bread, jam, a Bible verse, and a card with their handwritten phone number. Many were moved, saying they had never been welcomed with such warmth anywhere. And it was precisely because of this affection that, when she fell ill for a few days, the entire neighborhood rallied. They took turns bringing soup, cleaning the yard, watering the plants. Someone put a sign on the tree, "We love you, Helen. Come back to your porch soon." And she came back, stronger than before. Emily, always nearby, began recording their balcony encounters in short videos. She captioned them with things like Grandma's Wisdom, Saturday Reflection, or Healing Hug. The videos, to everyone's amazement, went viral. Hundreds of thousands of people began following the Balcony Grandma. With that came invitations for lectures, interviews, and even social campaigns. But Helen refused almost everything. She said her mission was there, among those familiar faces, among the plants and wicker chairs. Jesus also walked through small villages, she said. And that's where the greatest miracles happened. One day, a news crew showed up unannounced. They said they'd heard about Love Street. They wanted to film a Christmas special. Helen, shy, only agreed because the crew promised to show the stories of the people in the neighborhood, not just hers. And it was one of the most watched programs of the year. After the screening, letters and gifts began arriving from all over the states. People felt inspired, people wanted to visit, people wanted to donate. Helen said, "I don't need anything, but there are so many people who do." And she organized a charity fair in her backyard. Food, clothes, prayers, and hope. At that fair, a boy named Samuel approached with a notebook in his hands. "Ms. Helen, can I read a poem I wrote for you?" She smiled and said, "Of course, my love." The boy read, his voice trembling, "You are the sunflower on our street. Even when the sun is not shining, you shine." Helen wept. And everyone wept with her. From then on, a new tradition was born. Every month, neighbors would gather on the last Saturday to celebrate something. Birthdays, victories, even losses. Always with music, cake, and prayer. Helen was the hostess, even when she said she was tired. Because, deep down, that was what kept her heart beating. And it was during one of these meetings that Emily discovered something that would change everything. While sorting through an old closet in the house, she found a box of letters. Letters written by Helen, never sent, to people who had passed through her life. And among them, a letter that seemed to have returned. It was a letter addressed to Denise. The woman who, years before, had knocked on the door with 3 hungry children on Christmas Eve. The letter was yellowed, but intact. Helen had never sent it. I didn't know the address, so I left it to God. And there, on that porch, with tears in her eyes, Emily decided she would find Denise. If it were the last thing she did. The search began. Emily used social media, old town records, and conversations with residents. It took weeks, but finally, she found a clue. Denise lived in another state, and yes, she remembered Helen. And yes, she really wanted to see her again. The reunion would be epic. Helen didn't know it yet. She thought it was just another Saturday afternoon, with cakes and children running around the yard. But what was about to happen would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone around her. Because when love is planted sincerely, it returns. In ways we can't even imagine. And it was a rainy Sunday when Emily, trying to help Helen reorganize the closets, found an old cardboard box hidden under blankets in the back of the dresser drawer. Opening it, she found dozens of letters, all neatly folded, some yellowed with age, others still scented with lavender. Helen entered the room and, seeing the box, was silent for several long seconds. "These are letters I never sent, but I wrote with all my heart," she said. Emily gently began to read softly. They were words of love, longing, forgiveness. Some addressed to her children, others to distant friends, and one in particular, addressed to Helen herself, written by Denise, the woman who appeared on Christmas Eve years ago. Denise's letter was there, dated 5 years after that night. "Dear Helen, I never knew how to thank you. That night saved my soul. I promised God I would come back to find you and show you what you did for me and the children. I'm still trying. One day, I hope this letter finds you." Emily and Helen looked at each other. It was as if heaven had signed that envelope. Helen remained silent for days afterward. She read and reread Denise's letter. She revisited the memories of that magical night, the smell of punch, the children's laughter, the look of gratitude in that desperate mother's eyes. "Are they okay?" she asked, looking out the window, as if expecting to see them passing by at any moment. Emily, driven by something bigger, began searching. She scoured social media and checked church records, until she found a clue, a profile named Noah D. Taylor, with posts about faith, overcoming obstacles, and a woman who had changed his life when he was a child. She knew. It was him. She sent a message. And a few days later, a reply. "Emily, I'm crying. My mother spoke of Helen as if she were an angel. She saved us. Please, tell her she's alive." Emily trembled as she read it. Helen, upon hearing this, fell to her knees. "Lord, you never forget." The reunion was carefully planned. Helen didn't know what to wear, how to react. "What if they forgot me?" she asked. Emily smiled. "They never forgot you. You saved their lives." And there, for the first time in a long time, Helen let anxiety invade her heart. But along with it came hope. When Denise, now gray-haired, entered Helen's backyard, holding Noah and her sister's hands, the scene seemed like something out of a movie. They embraced silently, cried, laughed, and stared at each other for a long time, as if making up for lost years with a single glance. "You are our mother of the heart," Denise said. And Helen, her voice breaking, replied, "You have always been my children of faith." Noah handed Helen something, a copy of the note he'd hidden away years ago when she was still a child. "If I ever can, I'll pay you back." Now he was the director of a social project. And he stood there, before her, as living proof that love is never in vain. Helen looked at each of them as if witnessing a miracle with her own eyes. "Lord, you are faithful," she whispered, while Emily recorded it all with tears in her eyes. The entire neighborhood gathered that day. The balcony became an altar. And there, under the soft afternoon sun, the promise of a lifetime was fulfilled. But there was more. Denise brought with her photos, stories, and memories she'd preserved over the years. She told him how Helen inspired her to start a support group for single mothers, how her words had sustained her through her darkest days. And Helen listened to it all like someone receiving a gift she never dared ask for. The forgotten letter, which seemed like just another one among many, was the thread that connected past and present. An invisible thread of faith and love that never broke. Emily framed the letter and hung it on Helen's living room wall. "That letter changed everything," she said. "And now, no one will ever forget it." That night, Helen wrote in her journal, "Today I realized that nothing we do out of love is ever lost. The words we write, even if they are not sent, fly straight to God's heart. And in due time, He answers." And so, the forgotten letter became a testament. The children who had once been welcomed on that cold night were now grateful adults, multiplying goodness. And Helen, even at her advanced age, felt more alive than ever. Because what began as a shared supper became an eternal legacy. And it all started with a letter. A simple letter, tucked away in the back of a drawer. It was a typical Tuesday, with the smell of bread baking and dishes drying in the sink, when Helen heard 3 knocks on the door. Opening the door, she found a young man wearing a cap, a backpack, and a camera in his hand. "Are you Miss Helen?" he asked, smiling. She frowned suspiciously. "I am. Why?" The young man introduced himself as Josh, a content creator who traveled the country telling real stories of inspiring people. "I've received dozens of messages about you. They said I needed to come here." Helen almost closed the door. She thought it was a joke. But Emily appeared and confirmed it. It was true. Helen was speechless. "But I'm just an old lady with old stories." Josh smiled. "And that's exactly what the world needs to hear." He asked permission to record. Helen was reluctant. She didn't like cameras, didn't think she had anything special to say. But Emily took her hand and said, Tell me what you never had the courage to tell." The interview began on the porch. Josh asked simple questions, and Helen answered with the naturalness of someone speaking from the heart. She talked about her childhood, her losses, her children, and the sleepless nights praying for strangers. With each answer, Josh's face became emotional. And Emily, behind the camera, wept softly. But it was when Helen told him about the Christmas she welcomed Denise and the children that everything changed. Her voice trembled, her eyes lost in time. "You never know when you're welcoming an angel disguised as a need," she said. And Josh knew in that instant, that story needed to reach the world. The interview lasted over 3 hours. Helen only stopped when daylight was already hiding behind the rooftops. Josh thanked her with a tight hug. "You changed my heart today," he said. And she replied, "It wasn't me. It was God." The video was edited that same week. When it was published, the reaction was immediate. Thousands of views in just a few hours. Comments from people said they had reconciled with family members, prayed again, and decided to help others. Helen became a symbol of hope. But he still didn't understand why. Josh returned weeks later with an envelope. "I want to show you something." It was an invitation to appear on a national TV show honoring people who quietly transformed the world. Helen declined. "I already have everything I need." But something in the letter changed her mind. It was the host's name, Noah D. Taylor. Helen froze. Emily nodded. Yes, it was the same Noah from Christmas Eve. The same boy she'd taken in when he was still little. Now he was a host. And he was inviting her, without knowing it was her. Helen sat up slowly. "Lord, are you kidding me?" The show was filmed in secret. Noah didn't know who the guest was. Helen was driven to the studio, where a team did her makeup, prepped her, and treated her like a queen. She was trembling. "What if he doesn't recognize me?" Emily held her hand. "He'll recognize me, with his heart." On stage, Noah began his speech. "Today we're going to meet the woman who changed my life when I was just 7 years old. I was a hungry, cold, scared boy. And she gave me everything, including faith." Helen, behind the curtain, wept. The audience did too. When she entered, there was complete silence. Noah froze. And after a few seconds, he fell to his knees on the floor. "It's you. It's you." Helen hugged him like a mother hugs a child returning from afar. And he, like a prodigal son, wept like a child. The audience gave a standing ovation. The video of this reunion broke all channel records. It was shared by celebrities, churches, and schools. Helen received letters from various countries, people saying they wanted to be like her. But she kept repeating, I just did what anyone should do. Love. The unexpected fame didn't change her routine at all. Helen continued her prayers on the porch, her pies on weekends, her loving notes left in neighbors' mailboxes. The only difference is that now the whole world knew. But the real impact wasn't in the fame. It was in the stories that grew out of it. A woman who adopted 3 children in Helen's honor. A pastor who created a group called Heart of Helen at his church. A girl who decided to become a social worker because of her. And it all began with 3 knocks on the door. A stranger with a camera. And a woman who thought she was nothing special. But God knew. God always knew. Because when love is lived in silence, all heaven makes a point of crying out for it. And that scream would echo even further, farther than Helen ever imagined. After appearing on Noah's show, Helen's life took on a different rhythm. Even though she wasn't seeking fame, the invitations, letters, and visits multiplied. But there was one absence that hurt more than all the other presences, her middle son. The only one who hadn't yet reappeared. She prayed for him every day. She never mentioned his name aloud, but in the silence of her soul, it was for him that the tears fell onto her pillow. Lord, even if I don't see him again in this life, keep his heart. Remind him of who he is. Emily knew. She felt. And she decided to act. Without telling Helen, Emily began a tireless search. She found old schoolmates, followed leads on social media, and called companies. Until, finally, an answer. He was living in Texas, far from everything, working in an auto repair shop. Emily wrote a handwritten letter. She told her everything. And waited. Weeks later, a reply arrived. A short message, written in shaky handwriting. Emily, would she still forgive me? Emily cried as she read it. She simply replied, she never stopped loving you. Days later, he boarded a bus, without luggage, only with a heavy heart. Helen sat on the porch, as she did on so many afternoons. A gentle breeze swayed the sunflowers. When she heard footsteps at the gate, she looked up slowly. But when she saw that face, her heart stopped for a second. Michael! He lowered his head. It's me, Mom. She ran as if gaining years of life in seconds. She hugged him tightly, without saying a word. He cried like a child, begging for forgiveness between sobs. Helen simply said, "Shoo, you're home now." It was the longest hug in the history of that street. Michael stayed there for weeks. He helped in the garden, learned old recipes, and walked with his mother at dusk. And, little by little, the hurt gave way to healing. Helen didn't want to know what he did or didn't do. I just wanted him to know that he never stopped being a son. One of those days, Michael found his mother's old diary. He read excerpts of prayers written for him. Lord, wherever he is, cover him with your love. Lord, if he is sad, may he feel my embrace in the form of wind. He cried for hours. And in the end, he promised, I will take care of you now. The neighborhood watched with tears in their eyes. It seemed the story was finally getting the ending it deserved. But there was still more. For Helen's birthday, Michael prepared a surprise. He invited all the children, grandchildren, and neighbors and threw a backyard party with lights, flowers, and praise. Helen, seeing everyone gathered, could barely speak. Lord, I've lived to see this. Emily, her eyes shining, said, There's more. And she pulled someone from the crowd. It was Helen's daughter, the one who lived farther away. She came with her granddaughter in her arms. Grandma Helen, this is Rose. She already knows how to pray, you know. Helen knelt and hugged the child as if time had turned back. And there, in the midst of everyone, she prayed aloud. Thank you, God. Because even when I thought I'd been forgotten, you were just preparing this reunion. It was the biggest event in the street's history. People came from far and wide. TV channels appeared. But what really mattered was the warmth in the hugs, the healing in the reunions, the love in every detail. Helen, that day, seemed to float. It was as if she were 20 years old again. And even with everyone around her, she found a moment to sit on the porch, look up at the sky, and say, Thank you for saving each one. I know I don't deserve it, but the Lord always gives more than we ask for. Emily came over, sat beside her, and whispered, The best is yet to come. Because even after so many miracles, God still had something surprising in store for Helen. Something that would come when she least expected it. That night was especially quiet. Helen, already in her pajamas, sat in the porch rocking chair and gazed up at the starry sky. Something inside her pulsed differently. It wasn't sadness, but it wasn't joy either. It was as if her soul knew something profound was about to happen. She closed her eyes and began to pray softly. She gave thanks for life, for the reunions, for the pain that taught her as much as the smiles. She asked for forgiveness for the times she doubted. And then a tear fell. Just one. But soon others came. And more. And she didn't try to hold it back. They were old, choked-back tears, hidden behind smiles over the years. Tears of absence, of longing, of fear, of faith. Tears that finally found the courage to come out. And in that moment, Helen understood, crying is also a form of praise. Emily, seeing the scene from the doorway, didn't dare interrupt. She simply grabbed a blanket and carefully draped it over her grandmother's shoulders. She sat beside her and held her hand. No words were spoken. Because there, in that silence filled with presence, they both knew God was there. Helen looked at Emily and said softly, "You're the granddaughter I asked God for without knowing I was asking." Emily wept. "And you're all I needed to remember who I am." They hugged for long minutes. And the gentle wind felt like confirmation from heaven. That same night, Helen wrote in her journal again. "Today I cried what I'd held back for years. But it was different. It wasn't pain. It was liberation. I felt God cleansing my soul, preparing me for something new. Something beautiful." She didn't know what it would be. But she knew she was ready. In the days that followed, Helen seemed lighter. She walked more calmly, her smile brighter. The neighborhood noticed. "You look like you've seen an angel," Martha said, laughing. Helen simply replied, "Maybe I did." And everyone laughed, unaware of what was to come. Michael, the reunited son, began reading the Psalms every morning with his mother. Emily recorded videos of the readings, and these videos were shared by thousands of people. One video reached a terminally ill woman who wrote, "These words gave me peace. Thank you, Helen." When Emily read this aloud, Helen cried again. But this time, it was different. It was as if each tear was a seed watered by faith. "If I can bring peace to someone, even just one person, it's worth it," she said. And Emily knew, this woman was a walking blessing. One day, Helen received an unusual invitation. A group of missionaries wanted to baptize children in a nearby lake and asked her to pray for them. Helen, surprised, accepted. Upon arriving, she found dozens of people who recognized her from the videos. She was greeted with applause, like a grandmother to all. During the prayer, something incredible happened. A child approached, took her hand, and said, "I asked Jesus to send me a grandmother, and he sent you." Helen burst into tears. "You don't know how long I've waited to hear that." And in that moment, she knew that God was still writing new chapters. After that baptism, Helen began to be called to speak at churches, schools, and community centers. She never prepared speeches. She just told stories. And people listened with tearful eyes and open hearts. It was as if each word she spoke was a drop of healing. But the most impactful part wasn't the public events. It was the silent visits. Women knocking on doors with children in their arms, lost young people, lonely elderly people. Everyone found in Helen not just advice, but a home for their hearts. And she said, "It's all his. I only lend my time." One Sunday, after church, Helen was surprised. The church organized a tribute with photos from her life, stories from people touched by her story, and songs she sang with her children when they were small. She tried to hold back the tears, but couldn't. Because in that moment, she understood that it had all been worth it. Emily had an even bigger surprise planned. She invited everyone who had been helped by Helen over the decades. They came from all over the country. One by one, they took the stage to tell how she had changed their lives. And at the end, they sang in chorus a hymn she herself had taught them years ago. Helen couldn't stop crying. But she cried with a smile. It was as if God had prepared that moment just for her. As if to say, Daughter, I saw everything, and I rejoice in you." She closed her eyes and felt an invisible embrace. It was heaven manifesting on earth. And even after that unforgettable day, Helen didn't settle. She continued visiting, caring, and praying. Because she understood that serving isn't a phase, it's a way of life. And every tear she'd ever shed was now a source of rivers of life in the lives of others. And it was in this rhythm of surrender, with her heart lighter than ever, that Helen sat back on the porch. She looked up at the sky and said, "Lord, you can use me as you wish. I am yours." And there, in that simple prayer, the next miracle began to unfold. It was a bright spring morning when Helen woke to the sound of laughter coming from the backyard. She found it strange, as she hadn't planned anything that day. She got up slowly, put on her slippers, and went out onto the porch. What she saw made her heart race. The porch was decorated with flowers, old photos, and little banners that read, "Thank you, Helen." All the neighbors were there. Emily, Michael, Noah, Denise, even people Helen hadn't seen in decades. There was a lavish table, music playing, and a special chair with her name embroidered in gold. Helen brought her hands to her face. "What is this, my God?" Emily approached, holding a gift box. "Today is your day. We wanted to thank you for everything." And, one by one, everyone approached, handing out little letters, symbolic objects, small gifts with great meaning. Noah gave him a copy of the first Bible she ever gave him. Denise gave him a handmade quilt bearing the names of everyone Helen had helped. Michael gave him a video with clips of his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren saying, "We love you." And Emily gave him the greatest gift of all. It was an envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper bearing the crest of a Christian university. Helen read silently, Center for Compassion Studies, Honorary Chair, Helen Grace. She had been honored with the naming of an entire course dedicated to the study of neighborly love. She fell to her knees, weeping. Emily hugged her. "They created this course inspired by your story. Thousands of students will learn to serve because of you." Helen couldn't hold back her tears. "I don't deserve all this." And everyone, in unison, responded, "Yes, you do. You changed our lives." But there was more. A group of children filed in, holding white balloons. Each represented a story transformed by Helen: neighbors' children, Emily's students, adopted orphans. Each child wore a sign on their chest with phrases like, "She taught me to pray," or "She believed in me." At the end of the line, a little girl named Rose handed Helen a sunflower-shaped brooch. "So you'll never forget to shine." Helen hugged her so tightly it felt like they were about to melt their hearts together. And there, in front of everyone, she said, "You are my greatest gift." A children's choir began to sing a song Emily had composed based on Helen's sayings, "Love is the best prayer. Service is the joy of the heart." The melody was soft yet strong, and each note seemed to bring another tear of joy to her eyes. The most touching moment came when they opened a time capsule Helen had buried with her children decades ago. Inside were drawings, children's letters, a lock of hair, and a note that read, "If we ever forget, this will remind us." Helen smiled, her face wet. Michael took the microphone and said, "Mom, we forgot for a while. But now everything we do is because of you. The world needs more Helens." The audience, moved, gave a standing ovation. And Helen, embarrassed as ever, just looked up at the sky and murmured, "Thank you, God." To close, Emily handed out an invitation. "The city wants to name the neighborhood square after you." Helen tried to decline. "I don't need it." But the mayor appeared in person, tears in his eyes. "You don't need it. But we need to remember." The party lasted all day. But the memory would last forever. Helen returned home, took off her shoes, sat on her bed, and wrote in her diary, "Today, heaven came to visit earth. And it came in the form of gratitude." Afterward, she said a final prayer, and fell asleep smiling. Because sometimes, God saves the most beautiful surprise for the end. And after all this, what remains? This is the example of a woman who didn't wait for recognition, who didn't ask for applause, who loved in silence and served with her own hands. Helen taught us that true miracles lie not in great achievements, but in small gestures, made with faith and tenderness. In welcoming glances. In outstretched hands. In embraces that heal. Now, I want to ask you, how many Helens do you know and never thank? How many times do we close ourselves off in our own world and forget that there's someone right there, right next to us, in need of a smile, a call, a prayer? Have we been a light, or have we just been waiting for others to light the way? What would you do if someone like Helen showed up at your door? What if you were the Helen of your street, your church, your family? Isn't it time to embrace that role and start writing your own story of love for others? If this story touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Call someone. Write a letter. Donate something. Take action. Because sometimes, the biggest transformation begins with a small action, but one made with love. Take this moment and answer me. Have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever felt this calling to serve? Tell me in the comments. Let's make this space a place of testimonies and hope. And of course, if you want to keep hearing real stories like this, with soul, truth, and purpose, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This helps me continue bringing light into your life and the lives of those who need it most. Remember, faith is fueled by action. And every gesture you make could be the answer to someone's prayer. Don't wait for the heavens to open with thunder. Sometimes God knocks on our door, with a camera, warm bread, or a long hug.